The doors of the throne hall slammed open before I even reached them, and 2 guards grabbed my arms and pulled me inside. I did not know why I had been summoned. I only knew that the air in that room felt wrong, heavy, like something terrible was about to happen, and everyone already knew it, except me. The Threnny Dominion did not summon humans like me for pleasant reasons. I had spent 3 years on this world as a liaison soldier, a leftover piece of a peace treaty between Earth and this empire of tall, pale, crystal-skinned beings who called their inner power the current. Most of them looked at me the way you look at an insect that wandered into your house, useful for a task, maybe, but never an equal. At the far end of the hall, King Varkessian sat on a throne, carved from black stone, that seemed to drink in the light. Beside his throne, on her knees, was a young woman with silver-hued skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. She was shaking, not from cold, from fear. I recognized her, Princess Leora, the king's youngest daughter, the one the entire court called broken, because unlike her brothers and sisters, she had no current running through her blood. No power, no gift. In a society that measured worth by strength alone, she was less than nothing. A tall noble stood near the throne, his robes lined with silver thread, his face carved into a smile that did not reach his eyes. Lord Threxen. I had heard his name before, always spoken in careful whispers. He was ambitious, and everyone knew ambition in this court often ended with someone else's blood on the floor. She has failed the trial again, Threxen said, his voice smooth as poured oil. 3 failures. The law is clear, my king. A royal who cannot channel the current after 3 trials is not fit to carry your bloodline. She endangers the throne simply by existing. Mercy would be a mistake. I felt my stomach tighten. I understood exactly what he meant, even if he never said the word aloud. He wanted her gone, permanently. The king's jaw was tight. He looked at his daughter, and for one heartbeat, I saw something human in his alien eyes. Pain. Then it vanished, buried under the mask a king has to wear. The law demands a resolution, Varkessian said slowly. Not necessarily her death. Threxen's smile thinned. Then what resolution does the king propose? She cannot rule. She cannot fight. She cannot even lift a ceremonial blade without her arms trembling. What use is a princess who is nothing but a liability? The king's eyes moved across the hall, and to my shock, they landed on me. There is an old law, he said, older than your ambition, Threxen. A weak royal may be given away, bonded to an outsider, removed from the succession entirely. It satisfies the requirement. She is no longer a threat to the throne. She simply leaves it. Whispers spread through the hall like wind through dry grass. Threxen's eyes narrowed, clearly searching for the trap, but finding none that would stop him from getting what he wanted. The princess would be gone from his path either way. An outsider, Threxen repeated, and then his gaze slid toward me, and his lips curled with amusement. You mean to give her to the human? The whole hall turned to look at me. I stood there, frozen, feeling every pair of alien eyes measuring me and finding me small. The human has served the Dominion faithfully, the king said. He has no claim to power, no house to advance, no ambition that threatens my throne. He is precisely nothing to worry about. I wanted to say something, anything, but guards were already moving me forward, closer to the throne, closer to the girl kneeling on the cold floor. She did not look up at me. Her hands were pressed flat against her knees, and I could see them shaking. You would hand your own daughter to a lesser species? Threxen asked, his voice dripping with false concern, though I could hear the satisfaction underneath it. How far the royal bloodline has fallen. She lives, the king said simply. That is more than you offered her. Threxen bowed his head, but I caught the flicker of victory in his eyes before he turned away. To him, this was as good as an execution. A princess bonded to a human, stripped of her title, cast out of the world that mattered. She would disappear into irrelevance, and he would never have to dirty his hands. The king rose from his throne and descended the steps, each footstep echoing through the silent hall. He stopped in front of his daughter, and for a moment, something almost gentle crossed his face. Leora, he said quietly, so quietly I almost did not catch her name. Stand. She stood, but her legs trembled with the effort. She still would not look at me. I understood why. To her, this was not rescue. This was banishment, dressed up as a kindness. She was being handed to the very species her people saw as beneath them, and I doubted anyone had told her that this was better than the alternative. The king turned to me. Up close, he was even more imposing, his eyes like twin embers set into pale stone. "Human," he said. "Do you understand what I am asking of you?" I straightened my back, even though every instinct told me to look away from a being who could probably end my life with a single word. "I am not sure I do, Your Majesty." "I am giving you my daughter," he said. "You will take her from this palace. You will keep her alive. You will keep her hidden from those who wish her gone. In exchange, the Dominion will owe you nothing, and you will owe the Dominion nothing. This is not a gift of value, human. It is a gift of a burden. Do you accept it?" I looked at the princess. She finally lifted her eyes to mine, and what I saw there was not gratitude. It was humiliation, and beneath that, something rawer. A girl who had been told her entire life that she was worthless, now watching that verdict become official in front of the whole court. I thought about walking away. I thought about how easy it would be to refuse, to let the politics of an alien empire stay exactly that, someone else's problem. But I also thought about the shaking in her hands, and the way Threxen had smiled like a predator that had already won. "I accept," I said. The hall erupted into murmurs, some amused, some scandalized. Threxen's smile did not waver, because to him, my acceptance changed nothing. He believed, like everyone else in that room, that this was the quiet end of Leora's story. He had no idea it was only the beginning. The king placed a hand briefly on his daughter's shoulder, the closest thing to affection I had seen from him. "Go," he said. "Do not look back at this place. There is nothing here for you anymore." Guards escorted us out of the hall, through corridors lined with statues of Threnny warriors, each one radiating the kind of power Leora had never possessed. She walked beside me in silence, her shoulders stiff, her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to let anyone see her break. Outside, the sky over the capital was the deep violet color it always turned near evening, and the air smelled of ash and metal from the forges below the city. I did not know where we were supposed to go. I did not have a home here, not really. Just a small assigned quarter near the outer wall, meant for a single soldier, not a princess and her guardian. "You did not have to say yes," she said suddenly, her voice sharp, almost accusing. It was the first thing she had said to me directly. "No," I agreed. "I didn't." "Then why did you?" I thought about it honestly before answering. Because she deserved honesty more than comfort. Because the alternative was watching you die, in that hall, while everyone called it justice. I've seen enough of that kind of justice to know I don't want any part of it. She studied me for a long moment, distrust written clearly across her face. "You think this makes you noble. It does not. You have taken in something broken because it made you feel important. That is all this is." Her words stung more than I expected, but I did not argue. I understood where the anger came from. She had spent her whole life being told what she was not, and now she had been handed to a stranger from another world, expected to be grateful for the humiliation of it. "I don't think you're broken," I said instead. She let out a short, bitter laugh. "You do not know me." "No," I said. "But I know what it looks like when someone has already decided who you are before you've had a chance to prove them wrong." For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes that was not anger or fear, curiosity maybe, or disbelief that a human would say something like that to her at all. We reached the small stone building assigned to me, plain and unremarkable compared to the palace she had grown up in. She stood at the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, as if crossing that threshold meant accepting everything that had happened to her that day. Behind us, far across the city, in a tower overlooking the palace grounds, Lord Threxen watched the small figure of the princess disappear into the humans' quarters. He did not smile this time. His eyes were calculating, already planning the next move in a game he believed he had already won. He was wrong. He simply did not know it yet. That night, I sat outside the door while Leora remained inside, silent, unwilling to speak to me further. I did not push her. I understood that trust was not something that could be forced, especially not after a day like the one she had just survived. But I made a quiet promise to myself as I watched the twin moons rise over the Threnny capital. Whatever this girl was told she could never become, I intended to prove every single one of those people wrong. I just did not yet know how much that promise would cost either of us, or how far it would carry her. From a trembling girl kneeling on a throne room floor, to something the entire Dominion would one day be forced to respect. The first week was quiet, but quiet did not mean peaceful. Leora barely spoke to me, and when she did, her words were short and guarded, as if every sentence cost her something. She spent most of her time sitting near the small window of my quarters, watching the palace spires in the distance, the home she no longer belonged to. I did not push her to talk. I had learned a long time ago, back on Earth during the war that brought humans and the Threnny Dominion into contact in the first place, that people who have been broken down do not respond well to being rushed. So instead, I gave her space, and I focused on something I could control: food, shelter, safety. The basic things nobody had apparently bothered to think about when they decided her fate in that throne room. On the 8th day, everything changed. I was outside splitting firewood, more out of habit than necessity, when I heard raised voices near the outer market. I recognized one of them immediately: Leora. I dropped what I was doing and moved quickly toward the sound. When I turned the corner, I found her surrounded by 3 young Threnny soldiers, the kind who wore their armor a little too proudly, the kind who enjoyed reminding lesser beings of their place. One of them had knocked a basket of supplies out of her hands, and the contents were scattered across the dirt. "Pick it up," the soldier said, sneering down at her. "Or has the palace forgotten to teach its cast-off princess simple manners?" Leora's hands were clenched at her sides, her jaw tight, her eyes burning with a mixture of humiliation and fury. She did not move to pick anything up. "Leave her alone," I said, stepping into the circle. The soldiers turned toward me, and their sneers only widened. To them, I was even less significant than she was, a human, standing up for a princess without power, in a city that respected nothing but strength. "This does not concern you, outsider," the lead soldier said, "unless you would like to test your strength against ours." I could have backed down. It probably would have been the smarter choice, given that these 3 were trained warriors of a species stronger and faster than my own. But I had spent enough of my life watching bullies take advantage of people who could not immediately fight back, and I was not about to let it happen again, not to her. "I'm not interested in testing anything," I said calmly. "I'm interested in you walking away." The soldier laughed, and for a moment, I thought this would end badly. Then, from behind me, Leora spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor I knew was hiding underneath it. "He does not need to fight you," she said. "I can pick up my own belongings." She knelt down, gathering the scattered supplies with quiet dignity, refusing to give the soldiers the satisfaction of seeing her break. When she stood again, she looked each of them in the eye, one at a time, and something in her expression made them shift uncomfortably. "Careful," the lead soldier muttered, though his confidence had thinned considerably. "The current runs thin in some bloodlines. Best not to forget your place." They walked away, laughing among themselves, but the laughter sounded forced now, like they were trying to convince themselves they had won something. Leora did not speak until we were back inside the quarters. She set the basket down carefully, her hands finally steady. "You should not have interfered," she said. "It only makes things worse for both of us." "Maybe," I admitted. But I wasn't going to stand there and watch. She turned to face me fully for the first time since we had left the palace. "Why do you care what happens to me? I am nothing to you. A burden the king handed off, so his court would stop whispering about weakness in his bloodline." I set down the tool I had been carrying and met her eyes. "Where I come from, strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you build, every single day, choice by choice, until one day, you look back and realize you're not the same person you used to be." She studied me carefully, searching my face for some hidden mockery, some trick. She did not find one. "Your people believe that," she said slowly, "because your bodies cannot channel the current at all. You have no choice but to build strength the slow way." "Maybe that's exactly why it works," I said. "Nobody handed it to us. We had to earn every bit of it." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, quietly, almost as if she were afraid of the words themselves, she asked, "Could you teach me?" It was the first thing she had asked of me since the throne room. I did not answer immediately, because I wanted her to understand I was taking the question seriously. "It won't be easy," I said. "It won't look like anything your people consider proper training. No current, no channeling, no shortcuts. Just work. Real work, the kind that hurts before it helps." "I do not care how it looks," she said, and for the first time, I heard something steady in her voice, something that had not been there before. "I am tired of being something people pity." We started the next morning. The first lesson was not about fighting. It was about standing. I had her hold a simple posture, feet planted, spine straight, for longer than she thought she could manage. Her legs shook within minutes. She wanted to give up within the first 10. I did not let her. "This is stupid," she snapped, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air. "This is not how warriors are made." "This is exactly how warriors are made," I said. "Long before the fighting starts, they learn to endure something uncomfortable without quitting. That's the whole secret. It's not glamorous. Nobody tells stories about the boring parts." She glared at me, but she held the position another 5 minutes before her legs finally gave out, and she dropped to the ground, breathing hard. Over the following days, the lessons grew slightly more complex. Basic movements, balance, how to fall without hurting herself, how to redirect force instead of meeting it head-on. She struggled constantly, her body simply not built the way a Threni warrior's was, but something in her refused to stop trying, even when frustration brought tears to her eyes. "I will never be as strong as them," she said one evening, staring at her bruised knuckles after a difficult session. "You're not trying to be as strong as them," I said. "You're trying to be strong in a way they've never had to learn. That's different. That's actually harder." Word began to spread through the lower districts that the castoff princess was training with the human soldier. Most people found it amusing, a strange curiosity, nothing more. But not everyone found it harmless. Lord Threxen heard the rumors within days. He sat in his private chamber, listening to a spy's report with narrowed eyes, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. "She trains," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "With no current, no bloodline gift, learning human tricks in the dirt like some street fighter." "It is being spoken of as a curiosity, my lord," the spy said carefully. "Nothing more. The court finds it amusing." "For now," Threxen said quietly. He rose and walked to the window overlooking the city, his eyes drifting toward the outer district, where the humans' quarters stood. He had assumed the princess would fade into irrelevance, forgotten within a season, an embarrassing footnote in the Dominion's history. The idea that she might instead grow into something unpredictable did not sit well with him. "Keep watching her," he said. "If this curiosity becomes something more, I want to know before the court does." The spy bowed and left, and Threxen remained at the window a long while, turning the problem over in his mind. He did not yet believe the princess posed any real threat, but he understood, better than most, that threats often grew quietly, before anyone noticed them at all. Back at the outer district, unaware of the eyes now watching her more closely, Leora continued her training, with a determination that surprised even me. Each failure seemed to fuel her, rather than discourage her, and slowly, painfully, I began to see something shift in the way she carried herself. Her spine straightened a little more each day. Her eyes no longer dropped to the ground when soldiers passed by in the market. One afternoon, nearly a month into her training, she finally managed to hold her own during a sparring drill, long enough that I had to actually work to keep up with her movements. When it ended, she stood over me, breathing hard, a look of stunned disbelief on her face, as though she could not quite process what had just happened. "I did that," she said quietly. "You did," I agreed, pushing myself up from the ground. For the first time since the throne room, she smiled. It was small, uncertain, like she was not sure she was allowed to feel proud of herself, but it was real. I did not tell her about Threxen's spies watching from the shadows of the market square. I did not want to steal that moment from her, not when it had taken so much for her to earn it. But I knew, even then, that word of her progress would eventually reach the wrong ears, and that the quiet corner of the world we had built for ourselves would not stay hidden forever. Somewhere across the city, in a tower filled with maps and reports, Lord Threxen was already deciding that a curiosity that grew too strong needed to be tested, and tested soon, before it became something the court could no longer dismiss. None of us knew yet how soon that test would come, or how much it would demand of the girl who had once been too afraid to lift her eyes from the throne room floor. The summons arrived on a gray morning, carried by a palace herald who looked distinctly uncomfortable delivering it. Leora read the scroll twice before her hands began to tremble, though this time I could tell the shaking came from anger rather than fear. "He has invoked the right of challenge," she said, her voice tight. "In simple terms," I said, "what does that mean?" "It means Lord Threxen has formally challenged my right to carry royal blood," she said. "It is an old law, rarely used, meant for situations where a royal's fitness is questioned publicly. If I refuse the challenge, I am stripped of my bloodline entirely, and my name is erased from the royal records forever. If I accept, I must fight a champion of his choosing, in the open combat circle, before the entire court. And if you lose?" Her eyes met mine, steady despite the fear I knew was hiding underneath. "Then the outcome is the same as refusing, erased, forgotten, except everyone will have watched it happen." I understood immediately what Threxen was doing. He had heard about her training, about the quiet transformation happening in the outer district, and rather than let that story continue to grow, he intended to end it publicly, in a way designed to humiliate her beyond recovery. He was gambling that no amount of human training could overcome generations of raw, threnny power in open combat, and if he won that gamble, her brief spark of confidence would be extinguished forever, in front of everyone who might have started to believe in her. "You don't have to accept," I said. "There has to be another way." "There is not," she said. "If I refuse, I confirm everything they have always believed about me. If I accept and lose, I confirm it anyway, but at least I will have tried. I would rather be erased for trying than for hiding." I looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the frightened girl from the throne room, but someone who had spent weeks building herself into something new, someone determined not to let this challenge take that away from her without a fight. "Then we don't have much time," I said. "Let's use it well." The days that followed were unlike anything we had done before. I stripped away every unnecessary lesson and focused entirely on what mattered for the specific fight ahead. Threxen would choose a champion, almost certainly someone larger, faster, and infinitely more experienced in traditional threnny combat. Someone who relied on the current to enhance their strength and speed beyond anything a human body could match. "We can't beat raw power with more power," I told her, as we stood in the small training yard behind my quarters. "You don't have it, and pretending otherwise will get you killed. We beat it with something they've never had to develop because they've never needed it." "What is that?" she asked. "Adaptability," I said. "Endurance. The willingness to keep moving after most people would have already given up. Your opponent will expect you to break the moment things get difficult, because that's what everyone has always expected from you. We're going to make sure that expectation is the reason you win." We trained from before sunrise until well after the second moon rose each night. I taught her to read an opponent's weight shifts, to predict incoming strikes, not through strength but through observation. I taught her to conserve her energy, to let a stronger opponent exhaust themselves chasing an advantage that never quite landed. I taught her the value of patience, something the aggressive, power-driven threnny combat style rarely accounted for. She fell more times than I could count. She bruised, she bled a little, she cried once in frustration, when an exercise refused to click no matter how many times we repeated it. But she never once said the word stop. Word of the challenge spread quickly through the capital, and this time, nobody found it amusing. The court buzzed with anticipation, most assuming the outcome was already decided. Bets were quietly placed, almost all of them against her. Even sympathetic voices in the palace whispered that Threxen's champion would end things quickly, and that the kindest outcome would be a swift defeat, rather than a prolonged humiliation. King Varkesian summoned me privately, 2 days before the challenge, alone in a small chamber away from the prying eyes of the court. "You have trained her," he said. It was not a question. "I have," I said. "Do you believe she can win?" I considered lying, offering him some comfortable reassurance. I decided against it. I believe she has a chance. Whether that chance is enough depends on things I can't control, like who Threxen chooses as his champion, and how much she's able to draw on everything we've worked on when the moment actually arrives. The king studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the way only a being who had spent decades wearing a political mask could manage. "You have given her something none of us ever thought to give her," he said finally. "Not power. Belief." "She built that herself," I said. "I just showed her where to start." He did not respond to that, but something in his eyes shifted, something that looked almost like regret, though he said nothing further before dismissing me. The morning of the challenge arrived cold and clear. The combat circle sat at the center of the palace grounds, a wide ring of pale stone surrounded by tiered seating that filled with nobles, soldiers, and curious citizens long before the appointed hour. I had never seen the space so crowded. Leora stood beside me in the preparation chamber, dressed in simple, practical clothing rather than ceremonial armor, a choice that had already drawn murmurs of disapproval from traditionalists in the crowd. She did not seem to hear them. Her eyes were focused, calm in a way that surprised even me. "Whatever happens out there," I said, "you've already proven something to yourself that nobody can take away. Remember that, no matter what the crowd says." She nodded once, took a slow breath, and walked out into the circle. Threxon's champion stood waiting on the opposite side, a towering warrior named Korath, known throughout the capital for his brutal efficiency in the ritual circle. He had never lost a challenge. His presence alone was enough to make most opponents hesitate before the fight even began. Leora did not hesitate. The signal sounded, and Korath moved first, a burst of current-enhanced speed that closed the distance between them in a heartbeat. Leora did not meet the charge head-on. She pivoted at the last possible moment, letting his momentum carry him past her, exactly as we had practiced 100 times in the quiet training yard. The crowd gasped, clearly not expecting the fight to last past the first exchange. Korath recovered quickly, turning with a snarl, clearly irritated that his opening strike had failed. He came at her again, faster this time, and again she read the shift in his weight before the strike landed, sliding just out of reach, conserving her energy while he burned through his. Minutes passed. Korath's strikes grew more aggressive, more powerful, but also more predictable, driven by frustration rather than strategy. Leora remained calm, circling, testing, occasionally landing a quick strike of her own that did little damage but chipped steadily away at his confidence. The crowd's murmurs shifted from disbelief to something closer to stunned silence. Korath, sensing the tide of the crowd's attention turning, abandoned caution entirely and launched a final, overwhelming assault. Korath, blazing visibly around his fists, enough raw power in that single strike to end the fight instantly if it connected. It did not connect. Leora dropped low at the exact moment we had drilled 100 times, letting the strike pass over her, and drove upward with everything she had, using his own forward momentum against him. Korath stumbled, off balance for the first time in the entire fight, and Leora did not hesitate. She swept his legs, sending him crashing to the stone floor of the circle, and before he could recover, she had him pinned in a position from which he could not escape without conceding. The circle fell utterly silent. Korath, breathing hard, humiliated in front of the entire court, finally raised his hand in the traditional sign of concession. For one long moment, nobody moved. Then the crowd erupted, a wave of noise that seemed to shake the very stones of the palace grounds. Some cheered, some sat in stunned disbelief. Threxon, seated near the king, had gone pale, his carefully constructed plan collapsing in front of the entire court he had hoped to impress. Leora stood in the center of the circle, chest heaving, sweat-soaked, her hands shaking not from fear this time, but from the sheer weight of what she had just done. She looked toward me, and I nodded, unable to find words that would have meant anything compared to what she had just proven with her own body. King Varkessian rose slowly from his seat, his expression carefully neutral, though I caught the faint tremor in his hands as he descended toward the circle. "The challenge is decided," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "The bloodline stands." Threxon said nothing. He simply rose and left the gathering without a word, his humiliation written clearly across his retreating back. I watched him go, and something in his posture told me this was far from over. Men like Threxon did not accept public defeat quietly. They regrouped, they planned, they found new ways to strike. But for that moment, none of that mattered. Leora had walked into that circle expected to lose, expected to confirm every cruel assumption ever made about her, and she had walked out something entirely different. As she left the circle, exhausted but standing tall, the crowd that had once dismissed her now watched her with something new in their eyes. Not pity, not mockery. Something closer to respect, however grudging it remained. I knew, even as I helped her back toward the preparation chamber, that this victory had changed everything, and not entirely for the better. A curiosity the court could dismiss was one thing. A princess who could genuinely fight back was something else entirely, and somewhere in the palace, Lord Threxen was already deciding that quiet political games were no longer enough. 3 weeks passed after the challenge, and for a while, it seemed as though the quiet life we had built might actually hold. Leora trained every morning with a discipline that no longer needed my prompting, and in the afternoons, she had begun spending time in the lower districts, speaking with citizens who had once looked past her without a second glance. Something had shifted in how people saw her, and slowly, something had shifted in how she saw herself. I should have known the quiet would not last. It began with smoke. I woke before dawn to the smell of it, sharp and acrid, drifting through the cracks of the shuttered window. I was on my feet before I fully understood why, some instinct honed by years of service telling me that smoke at this hour, in this city, meant something had gone terribly wrong. Leora was already awake, standing near the window, her face pale in the dim light. "The palace," she said quietly. "Something is happening at the palace." We moved quickly through streets that had begun to fill with panicked citizens, all of them pointing toward the distant silhouette of the royal grounds, where dark smoke curled upward against the pale morning sky. Distant sounds reached us as we ran, sharp cracks and low rumbles that I recognized immediately as the sounds of a serious confrontation. "Threxen," Leora said, her voice hard. We reached the outer wall of the palace grounds to find chaos. Soldiers loyal to the crown clashed with a force wearing unfamiliar colors, banners bearing a sigil I did not recognize, but that Leora identified instantly as belonging to houses aligned with Threxen. This was no small uprising. This was a coordinated attempt to seize the throne itself, launched while the court still reeled from the humiliation Threxen had suffered weeks earlier. "We need to get to my father," Leora said, already moving toward a side entrance she clearly knew from years of growing up within these walls. I followed close behind, my mind racing through what limited resources we had. I was no stranger to combat, but this was not the kind of fight either of us had trained for specifically. This was chaos, numbers, uncertainty at every turn. Inside the palace, the fighting had already reached the inner corridors. We came across a group of loyal guards making a desperate stand near a collapsed section of hallway, outnumbered and struggling to hold their position against Threxen's soldiers. Leora did not hesitate. She moved into the fight beside the loyal guards, and I watched, with a strange mixture of pride and fear, as everything we had built together over the past months came together in a way that finally mattered. She was not the strongest fighter in that hallway. She never would be. Not against soldiers channeling the current at full strength. But she was smart, she was fast, and she understood how to use the chaos of a crowded fight to her advantage, in ways her opponents simply did not expect. I fought beside her, relying on tactics that felt almost foreign to the Threnny style of combat around us, using the environment, feinting, forcing our opponents to overextend, and punishing the mistakes that followed. Between the two of us, and the loyal guards fighting alongside, we managed to hold the corridor long enough for reinforcements to arrive from deeper within the palace. "The king," Leora said, breathing hard as the immediate threat was pushed back. "We need to reach the throne hall." We pressed forward, the sounds of battle echoing from multiple directions throughout the palace. It became clear as we moved that Threxen's plan had been carefully coordinated, striking at multiple points simultaneously to overwhelm the palace's defenses before reinforcements could organize a proper response. We found the throne hall under siege, King Varkesian and a small contingent of his personal guard holding a defensive position against a much larger force, led, unmistakably, by Threxen himself, who had abandoned any pretense of subtlety now that his plan had been set into motion. "You should have stayed hidden, little princess," Threxen called out when he spotted Leora entering the hall, his voice carrying the same false pleasantness I remembered from the day my life had first become entangled with hers. "It would have been kinder, letting you believe your small victory in the circle meant something. Now you will watch your father's throne fall, and there is nothing your human tricks can do to stop it. You're wrong, Leora said, stepping forward despite the danger, her voice steady in a way that would have been unthinkable months earlier. About all of it. The fighting that followed was unlike anything I had experienced since arriving on this world. Threxen's soldiers pressed hard against the king's dwindling guard, and for a long, terrible stretch of time, it seemed as though sheer numbers would be enough to overwhelm every advantage we had built. But something had changed in the palace beyond just Leora's training. Word of her victory in the circle had spread throughout the lower ranks of the military, and as the fighting dragged on, soldiers who might have once stayed neutral began arriving to reinforce the king's position, unwilling to stand by, while a princess who had earned genuine respect fought for her father's life. I fought at Leora's side through the worst of it, drawing on every scrap of training either of us possessed, adapting on the fly as the battle shifted and changed around us. There were moments I genuinely believed we would not survive the haul, moments where Threxen's soldiers pressed close enough that only quick thinking and quicker movement kept either of us standing. The turning point came when Leora, cornered by two of Threxen's strongest soldiers, did something I had not specifically trained her to do, but that reflected everything we had built together regardless. Rather than trying to overpower them directly, she used the confined space of the hall against them, forcing them to collide with each other in their eagerness to strike her down, buying just enough time for reinforcements to close the gap. Threxen, watching his carefully orchestrated coup begin to unravel, made one final desperate move, charging directly toward the king himself, clearly hoping that removing Varkesian personally would be enough to salvage the collapsing rebellion. Leora intercepted him. It was not an easy fight. Threxen was a seasoned warrior in his own right, driven now by desperation as much as ambition, and for several tense moments, the outcome hung genuinely uncertain. But Leora had spent months learning to fight not with raw power, but with patience, observation, and the refusal to break under pressure, exactly the qualities Threxen had never respected, and had therefore never learned to counter. When he finally overextended, driven by frustration at being held off by someone he still, even now, considered beneath serious consideration, Leora seized the opening without hesitation, disarming him, and forcing him to the ground in front of the very throne he had hoped to claim. The remaining rebel soldiers, seeing their leader defeated and reinforcements pouring into the hall, quickly began surrendering or fleeing entirely. Within the hour, what had begun as a coordinated coup had collapsed entirely, its leader captured, its momentum shattered by a princess the entire plot had been built on the assumption of underestimating. King Varkesian, breathing hard but very much alive, looked at his daughter standing over the man who had spent months trying to destroy her, and something in his expression finally cracked entirely open, years of carefully maintained distance giving way to something rawer and more honest. "You saved the throne," he said quietly, as though he still could not quite believe it. "I saved my family," Leora said. "The throne was simply attached to that." The king's eyes moved to me, standing exhausted beside his daughter, and for the first time since our very first meeting, I saw something in his expression that looked almost like gratitude, though it was clear the words themselves did not come easily to a man who had spent his entire life believing strength only came in one form. "I underestimated you both," he said finally. "I do not intend to make that mistake again." Around us, palace guards began securing the hall, tending to the wounded, restoring order to a palace that had nearly fallen entirely within the span of a single chaotic morning. Threxen was led away in restraints, his ambitions ending not in triumph, but in the very humiliation he had once hoped to inflict on someone he had never truly understood. Leora stood in the center of the throne hall, exhausted, bruised, her clothing torn from the fighting, and yet standing taller than I had ever seen her stand before. The girl who had once knelt trembling on this very floor, condemned by her own court as worthless, had just fought to save the throne that condemnation had nearly cost her. I watched her, and I understood, more clearly than ever, that whatever this strange arrangement between us had started as, it had become something neither of us could have predicted on that first terrible day in the throne hall. The coup was over, the immediate danger had passed. But as I looked around the damaged hall, at the king watching his daughter with new eyes, at the soldiers who had once mocked her now standing at careful attention in her presence, I understood that this day marked not an ending, but the beginning of something the entire Dominion would need time to fully understand. The weeks that followed the coup brought changes to the Threni capital that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. Threxon's remaining allies were quietly removed from positions of influence, some choosing exile rather than face the consequences of their involvement in the failed rebellion. The court, once a place of whispered mockery whenever Leora's name arose, now spoke of her with a caution that bordered on respect, though old habits of judgment did not disappear entirely overnight. I noticed the change most clearly in small moments. Soldiers who once looked past her in the corridors now offered proper acknowledgement. Nobles who had once avoided speaking to her directly now sought her opinion on matters of palace security, recognizing, however reluctantly, that her unconventional training had proven more valuable during the crisis than generations of traditional combat philosophy. King Varkesian summoned both of us to a private audience nearly a month after the rebellion had been fully put down, once the palace had returned to something resembling normal function. He received us not in the grand throne hall, but in a smaller chamber, one I had never seen used for anything but the most personal conversations. "I have spent many nights considering what happened," he said, once we were seated. "Not simply the rebellion itself, but everything that led to it, my own choices among them." Leora said nothing, watching her father carefully, clearly unsure where this conversation was heading. "I gave you away," the king continued, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, "believing I was sparing your life, while accepting that you would never truly matter to this dominion again. I told myself it was mercy. In truth, it was simply a more comfortable form of the same judgment everyone else had already passed on you." "You did save my life," Leora said carefully. "I did," he agreed, "but I did not believe, not truly, that you would become anything beyond what that judgment allowed. I was wrong, profoundly wrong, in a way that nearly cost me everything I claimed to be protecting." He turned his attention to me, and for a long moment, the weight of his gaze made it difficult to hold still. "You saw something in her that her own family failed to see," he said. "I do not offer that observation as a compliment lightly, human. It is, perhaps, the most honest thing I have said in this palace in a very long time." "She saw it in herself," I said. "I only helped her stop believing what everyone else had already decided." The king studied me a moment longer, before nodding slowly, as though accepting something he had resisted for a long time. "The Dominion has built its entire structure around the assumption that strength flows through blood alone, unearned, simply present or absent from birth. It is a comfortable belief, because it requires nothing of anyone. You have proven, quite thoroughly, that comfort and truth are not always the same thing." He rose from his seat and moved to stand before his daughter, and for the first time since I had known either of them, he reached out and placed both hands gently on her shoulders, an act of open affection I doubted the rigid formality of Threni royal life allowed very often. "You are no longer merely tolerated within these walls, Leora," he said. "You have earned your place here, in a way none of your siblings have ever been required to prove. I intend for the court to understand that distinction clearly, going forward." In the weeks that followed, the king made good on that promise. Leora's role within the palace expanded gradually. First as an advisor on matters of security, given her first-hand understanding of how traditional Threni combat philosophy could be exploited by a determined opponent, and eventually as a trusted voice in broader councils, her opinions sought rather than dismissed. The change did not happen entirely without resistance. Some traditionalists within the court continued to view her rise with quiet suspicion, uncomfortable with the idea that strength earned through effort might carry equal weight to strength inherited through bloodline. But their voices grew quieter with each passing month, drowned out by a court that had witnessed, undeniably, what that earned strength had accomplished when it mattered most. I remained in the capital, my original assignment as a simple liaison soldier having long since become something else entirely, though nobody in the palace seemed inclined to question the arrangement given everything that had unfolded. Leora and I continued training together, though the sessions had shifted from desperate necessity into something closer to shared purpose. Two people who had built trust through difficulty, now choosing to maintain it through partnership. One evening, several months after the rebellion, we sat together on the same outer wall, where I had once watched her disappear into my quarters for the first time. A frightened girl, who believed she had just been handed the final proof of her own worthlessness. Do you remember what I said to you that first night? She asked, watching the twin moons rise over the capital. You said I only took you in because it made me feel important, I said. I remember. She smiled faintly, an expression that would have been unthinkable from the trembling girl in the throne hall all those months ago. I was wrong about that. I have thought about it often, actually. I believe I said it because it was easier to believe you had selfish reasons than to consider the possibility that someone might simply see something worth protecting. I understand why you believed it, I said. Everyone else in your life had already told you what you were before you had a chance to prove them wrong. It made sense to expect the same from me. You never treated me as broken, she said, even before I gave you any reason to believe otherwise. You were never broken, I said. You were just untested. There's a difference, even if nobody around you seemed interested in pointing it out. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights flicker to life below the palace walls. A city that had nearly fallen to rebellion months earlier, now settling into a quieter, steadier rhythm. My father has begun speaking with other royal houses, she said eventually, quietly, testing whether the philosophy that shaped my training might hold value beyond just my own case. There are other children across the Dominion, considered unfit by traditional measures, dismissed the same way I once was. And he wants to know if what worked for you could work for them, I said. He does, she said. I told him it depends entirely on whether anyone is willing to actually try, rather than simply hoping for a different outcome, while changing nothing about how they approach it. I thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, as words slowly spread beyond the capital of the princess, who had transformed herself from the Dominion's most dismissed royal into one of its most respected voices. Other houses, cautiously at first, began seeking human advisors of their own, curious whether the philosophy that had reshaped Leora's fate might offer something valuable to their own overlooked children. It was a slow change, the kind that takes years rather than months to fully settle into a society as rigid as the Threnny Dominion had always been. But it was a real change nonetheless, and it had started with a single decision, made in a throne hall, on a day that everyone involved had assumed marked the quiet end of an unwanted princess's story. I often thought back to that first day, to the king's words when he had handed his daughter over to me, calling her a burden rather than a gift, certain that what he was giving away held no real value. I understood now why he had believed that. It was what his entire world had taught him to believe. But standing beside Leora on that palace wall, watching a girl who had once been unable to hold a simple combat stance for more than a few minutes, now carry herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every ounce of respect she now commanded, I understood something the king had not, back on that first terrible day. He had not given away a burden at all. He had simply failed to recognize, until it was almost too late, exactly what kind of warrior he was handing over, and exactly what she would become once someone finally gave her the chance to prove it herself.